On the evening of July 14, 2001, a bright orange Volkswagen Kombi stopped on the Stuart Highway in the center of Australia. The road was almost empty. The nearest substantial town was hundreds of kilometers away, and darkness had already settled over the desert. A man in a four-wheel drive had signaled to the Kombi and warned its occupants that sparks appeared to be coming from the rear of their vehicle. Peter Falconio stepped outside to investigate. His girlfriend, Joanne Lees, remained in the driver's seat and prepared to rev the engine while the two men looked behind the van. A short time later, Joanne heard a loud bang. Peter did not return. The stranger appeared beside her window, carrying a handgun. He restrained her hands with cable ties, covered her head, and tried to force her into his own vehicle. Joanne escaped into the darkness and hid among the scrub, while the man searched for her with a torch and a dog. When she finally reached the road and stopped a passing truck, Peter Falconio had disappeared. His body was never found. 4 years later, Bradley John Murdoch was convicted of Peter's murder and of attacking and attempting to abduct Joanne. The prosecution relied on Joanne's identification, DNA evidence, vehicle evidence, the timing of Murdoch's movements, and security camera footage recorded later that night. Murdoch denied every charge and continued to maintain his innocence until his death in 2025. The conviction answered the legal question of who murdered Peter Falconio. It did not answer the question that remained most important to his family. Where was Peter taken? Peter Marco Falconio was born on September 20, 1972, and grew up in West Yorkshire in England. He was the third of 4 sons. Friends and relatives later described him as sociable, energetic, and drawn to travel. Joanne Rachel Lees was also from the Huddersfield area. The two met in a nightclub in 1996 and began a relationship. By the following year, Joanne had moved to Brighton, where Peter was studying at university. Travel became an important part of their plans. They visited several countries together and gradually prepared for a much longer journey. On November 15, 2000, they left Britain and traveled through parts of Asia, including Nepal, Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, and Cambodia. In January 2001, they arrived in Australia on working holiday visas. They spent several months in Sydney, finding temporary work and saving money. Peter later bought an old orange Volkswagen Kombi, the type of van strongly associated with long-distance backpacking in Australia. It was not a fast or modern vehicle, but it gave them the freedom to travel at their own pace and sleep on the road. On June 25, 2001, the couple began the overland stage of their journey. Their planned route took them from Sydney through Canberra, Melbourne, and Adelaide, then north through the interior toward Darwin. They traveled with clothing, camping supplies, photographs, maps, and the ordinary possessions of 2 people, expecting to spend months on the road. The center of Australia is crossed by the Stuart Highway, a road running north and south through vast areas of sparsely populated land. Settlements can be separated by hundreds of kilometers. At night, traffic may become extremely light. A mechanical problem, a collision, or an encounter with another person can occur far from immediate assistance. By July 14, Peter and Joanne had reached Alice Springs. They continued north that day, intending to travel toward the rock formations then widely known as the Devil's Marbles, and now officially called Kalu Kalu. Their Kombi was old, and the journey was slow. During the afternoon and evening, they stopped at roadhouses and continued along the highway. At approximately 7:30 that evening, they were traveling north near Barrow Creek, about 300 kilometers from Alice Springs. Joanne later said that they had been aware of another vehicle behind them. It was described as a white Toyota four-wheel drive or utility vehicle with a canopy. Because the Kombi was slow, they expected the driver to pass. Instead, the other vehicle drew alongside. Its driver gestured urgently and indicated that Peter should pull over. Peter stopped on the side of the highway. The other driver stopped ahead of them and walked back. According to Joanne's account, the man said that he had seen sparks coming from the Kombi's exhaust or engine area. Peter went with him to inspect the rear of the van. Joanne moved into the driver's position. Peter asked her to rev the engine while the men examined the problem. She then heard a sound that she first understood as the engine backfiring. It was later treated by the prosecution as a gunshot. After a short interval, the stranger came to the front of the Kombi. Peter was no longer with him. The man was carrying a silver-colored handgun. He entered or reached into the van and ordered Joanne to move. She asked where Peter was, but received no useful answer. The man restrained her wrists behind her back with black cable ties arranged as improvised handcuffs. He attempted to secure her legs and cover her mouth. A sack or hood was placed over her head, restricting her view. Joanne later described the attacker as tall, with long or drooping facial hair and a distinctive appearance. She remembered the vehicle and the presence of a dog. Some parts of her description varied as she tried to recall events under extreme stress, and these variations later became a major subject of public argument and courtroom cross-examination. The attacker moved her toward his vehicle. Joanne believed that she was going to be raped or killed. At some point, while the man's attention was elsewhere, she found an opportunity to escape. Her hands were still tied behind her. She ran from the vehicles and entered the scrub beside the highway. The landscape offered little in the way of large trees or deep cover, but there were low bushes and uneven ground. Joanne forced herself beneath the vegetation and remained still. The man searched for her. She saw or heard the light from a torch moving through the darkness. She also believed he was using his dog to locate her. At times, the search came dangerously close. She later described the vehicle passing nearby more than once while she remained hidden. Joanne did not know where Peter was. She did not know whether he was injured, unconscious, or already dead. She also could not be certain that the attacker had left. The highway was quiet, and running toward the road too early could expose her position. For several hours, she remained in the bush with her wrists secured. Eventually, after the sounds and lights had disappeared, and she judged that the danger had passed, she moved back toward the highway. Shortly after midnight, a road train approached. Joanne ran onto the road and tried to attract the driver's attention. The truck stopped. Driver Vince Miller and the other men traveling with him found a frightened woman with cable ties around her wrists and an account of an armed attack in which her boyfriend had vanished. The drivers took her toward the Barrow Creek hotel, where the police were contacted. By the time officers began receiving the details, the attack had occurred several hours earlier. The offender had been given time to leave the district, conceal evidence, and decide what to do with Peter's body. Joanne's survival provided investigators with their only direct account of the crime. It also created an unusual evidential problem. There was a living eyewitness, but no body, no immediately identified suspect, and no clear motive. Peter and Joanne did not appear to know the attacker. Their belongings did not suggest a planned meeting. The stopping of the Kombi appeared to have been created by a false warning about a mechanical problem. The first task was to return to the area and locate the vehicles, Peter, or the attacker. Police reached the scene in the early hours of the morning. The orange Kombi was not standing where the couple had originally stopped. It had been driven away from the highway and concealed in the scrub. This supported Joanne's statement that the offender had remained at the scene after she escaped and had moved the van. Near the road, investigators located an area later described as containing blood. The amount and condition of the material became a subject of later debate because Peter's body was absent and the scene had been exposed to traffic, dust, animals, and the passage of time. The prosecution position was that Peter had been shot and killed. Without his remains, investigators could not perform an autopsy or establish the precise path of a bullet. Searches began across the surrounding land. Police, volunteers, trackers, aircraft and vehicles examined the highway and nearby bush. Aboriginal trackers studied the ground. One of those later associated with the inquiry was Teddy Egan. Joanne's movements into the scrub could be followed in parts of the area, supporting her account that she had hidden there. No comparable trail led investigators to Peter. The scale of the landscape immediately became the central difficulty. Barrow Creek was a tiny settlement on a highway crossing an enormous region. A driver familiar with the Northern Territory could reach tracks, cattle stations, dry watercourses, abandoned workings, wells, and areas rarely visited by the public. Even a body placed only a short distance from a road could become extremely difficult to locate once the surface was disturbed by weather and animals. Police established roadblocks and circulated descriptions of the offender and his vehicle. However, several hours had passed. The attacker could have traveled a considerable distance before the wider search was organized. Inside and around the Kombi, investigators preserved items that might contain fingerprints, fibers, hair, blood, or DNA. The cable tie restraints were recovered. Joanne's clothing was retained for forensic examination. The condition and location of the van were documented. At this stage, investigators did not know whether the offender had selected the couple at random or had followed them for some distance. They did not know whether the original plan had been robbery, sexual assault, abduction, or murder. They also did not know whether Peter's death had occurred immediately after the couple stopped or during a later struggle. What they did know was that the attack appeared organized. The man carried a firearm. He had prepared restraints. His vehicle offered space in which a person could be confined. He had a dog, and he was comfortable operating alone on a remote highway at night. After Joanne escaped, he was able to move the Kombi and remove Peter without attracting attention. The crime rapidly became international news. The disappearance of a British backpacker in the Australian Outback contained every element likely to attract intense coverage. There was a remote highway, an armed stranger, a young woman who had escaped into the darkness, and a missing man whose body could not be found. At first, Joanne was presented as a remarkable survivor. Reporters described the hours she had spent hidden in the scrub and the condition in which the truck drivers had found her. Her account was repeated across Australia and Britain. The tone soon changed. Some journalists and members of the public began examining her behavior rather than the evidence. Joanne did not always react in the way outsiders expected a grieving partner to react. She could appear controlled, distant, or uncomfortable during interviews. Photographs and television footage were interpreted as if facial expression could determine truthfulness. Questions were also raised about parts of her description. The exact appearance of the attacker, the style of his facial hair, the color and construction of his vehicle, and the breed or appearance of his dog were discussed repeatedly. Trauma, darkness, the hood over her head, and the speed of the incident provided obvious reasons why an eyewitness might not remember every detail consistently. Nevertheless, each difference was treated by some commentators as evidence that her story was unreliable. The absence of Peter's body encouraged further speculation. Some people suggested that he might still be alive. Others proposed that Joanne knew more about his disappearance than she had admitted. These theories often developed without evidence and followed a familiar pattern seen in other high-profile cases. When a crime has no body and no immediate suspect, attention turns toward the person who survived. The investigation also exposed private details of Joanne and Peter's relationship. It later emerged that Joanne had been communicating with another man and had been involved in an affair. This fact was relevant to the defense because it could be used to question the public image of the couple and to suggest possible alternative explanations. It was not evidence that she had murdered Peter or invented the attack. Joanne later explained that she had kept personal matters private because they were not responsible for what happened on the Stuart Highway. The media frequently treated secrecy about her relationship as if it was secrecy about the crime. The distinction was often lost. Police continued to treat Peter as the victim of a homicide and Joanne as the victim of an assault and attempted abduction. They examined her account in detail, tested the physical possibilities, and compared her statements with the scene. The cable tie handcuffs were particularly important. Joanne demonstrated how she had managed to move her bound hands from behind her back to the front of her body. Critics claimed that this was impossible or unlikely. In fact, people vary considerably in flexibility, and Joanne was able to reproduce the movement. The restraints themselves were preserved as evidence. The truck drivers who rescued her confirmed her condition in the early hours. She was distressed, her wrists were restrained, and she immediately reported that her partner had been attacked and that an armed man had tried to abduct her. She had not arrived after a long period in which she could calmly construct a complicated story. She emerged from the roadside in a state consistent with a recent violent event. The search for Peter continued on land and from the air. Police examined tracks, stations, wells, mine areas, and possible routes leading away from Barrow Creek. Reports of suspicious vehicles were investigated. People who had traveled along the highway were interviewed. Investigators also looked for a four-wheel drive matching Joanne's description. The Northern Territory and Western Australia contained many similar utility vehicles. White Toyota Land Cruisers were commonly used by station workers, mechanics, hunters, transport operators, and people traveling in remote regions. A canopy that appeared green under one type of lighting might appear another color in photographs or daylight. The description helped narrow the search, but could not identify one owner by itself. Security footage became another important line of inquiry. Several hours after the attack, a man driving a vehicle generally consistent with the suspect vehicle stopped at a service station in Alice Springs. Closed-circuit television recorded him inside the premises at approximately 12:38 in the morning. The images were not clear enough to produce an immediate identification. The man wore clothing and had a build and facial appearance that investigators considered relevant. Police released the footage publicly and asked for help. Many names were suggested. Some people recognized friends, relatives, or local drivers. Investigators had to examine a large number of possible identifications. The time of the recording mattered. Alice Springs lay south of the crime scene. If the attacker had left the Barrow Creek area and driven at speed, the journey to the service station was possible. The prosecution later argued that Bradley Murdoch was the man in the footage. The defense disputed the strength of that identification and argued that the images were too poor to provide a reliable conclusion. Forensic work on Joanne's clothing produced the most important physical lead. A DNA profile belonging to an unknown male was detected on her t-shirt. Related material was also examined on the cable ties and on the gear lever of the Kombi. At the time the samples were developed, police did not have a matching profile. DNA can identify a person only when investigators possess a comparison sample or can connect it through relatives and databases. The profile, therefore, became a silent lead waiting for a name. The first months of the inquiry produced many reports but no arrest. Police interviewed men whose vehicles, movements, criminal histories, or appearance brought them to attention. Among those interviewed was Bradley John Murdoch. Murdoch was born in Western Australia in 1958. By 2001, he had spent much of his life working with vehicles and traveling through remote areas. He had been a mechanic and truck driver and was familiar with long-distance roads, four-wheel drives, and the practical demands of the Outback. He also had a serious criminal history. In 1995, after drinking, he fired a weapon toward a group of Aboriginal people celebrating a football victory in Fitzroy Crossing. He was convicted and served a prison sentence. The incident showed that he possessed firearms, was prepared to use them recklessly, and held racist views. It did not by itself prove involvement in Peter Falconio's disappearance, but it became relevant when police later assessed him as a suspect in an armed roadside attack. Murdoch was involved in transporting cannabis across long distances. The prosecution later described a drug-running route between Western Australia and South Australia. Such journeys required knowledge of remote roads, fuel stops, police activity, and places where a vehicle or object could be concealed. Police first spoke to Murdoch in Broome in November 2001. At that point, they did not obtain the evidence necessary to identify him as the offender. His appearance was not immediately connected to Joanne's early description, and no useful comparison DNA sample was secured during that interview. The investigation changed after police obtained information from James Heppy, a man associated with Murdoch's drug activities. Heppy described Murdoch's movements, vehicle, weapons, and methods. His evidence was controversial because he was himself involved in crime and had reasons to cooperate with authorities. The prosecution did not rely on his character. It relied on whether parts of what he said could be independently checked. Information about Murdoch's relatives also assisted the DNA inquiry. Testing connected the unknown profile from Joanne's t-shirt to Murdoch's family line. Once investigators obtained a direct sample from Murdoch, they reported a match of extraordinary statistical strength. The forensic evidence did not mean that every biological trace in the case was perfect. Some samples were mixtures, some were weak, and contamination was raised as an issue. The central t-shirt profile, however, became one of the strongest parts of the prosecution case. Police also compared Murdoch's vehicle and dog with Joanne's description. Murdoch owned or used a white Toyota Land Cruiser-style vehicle fitted with a canopy. He traveled with a dog. He was tall, experienced with firearms, and familiar with the highway. His movements on July 14 were then reconstructed. The prosecution argued that Murdoch had been in Alice Springs before the crime and had left northward at a time, allowing him to encounter Peter and Joanne near Barrow Creek. It also argued that he could return south and appear at the service station, captured on security footage after midnight. Murdoch disputed this reconstruction. He maintained that he had not been at the crime scene and that the Crown had forced ordinary details of his lifestyle into a false narrative. Many people in the region drove similar vehicles, carried equipment, traveled with dogs, and used the Stuart Highway. The investigation was delayed by Murdoch's involvement in an unrelated criminal case in South Australia. In 2002, he was arrested and later tried on charges involving the alleged abduction and sexual assault of a woman and her daughter. He denied those allegations and was acquitted. The acquittal meant that the allegations were not proof of conduct and could not be treated as a conviction in the Falconio case. After the South Australian proceedings ended, Murdoch was arrested in connection with Peter Falconio's murder. He was extradited to the Northern Territory and charged with murder, assault, and the attempted abduction of Joanne Lees. By then, more than 2 years had passed since the night on the highway. Peter's body remained missing. The prosecution, therefore, faced a no-body murder trial. It had to establish beyond reasonable doubt that Peter was dead, that his death was caused deliberately, and that Murdoch was responsible. There was no autopsy, no recovered murder weapon, and no location where a body could be examined. The case depended on the combined effect of separate pieces of evidence. Joanne's testimony placed one man at the scene. The DNA connected Murdoch to her clothing and other relevant objects. His vehicle, dog, appearance, firearms experience, and movements were consistent with the offender. The security footage placed a man the Crown said was Murdoch at a location and time consistent with a return from Barrow Creek. Peter's complete disappearance, the blood at the scene, and the removal and concealment of the Kombi supported the conclusion that he had been killed. The defense argued that none of these pieces were safe enough. Joanne's identification had developed over time. The DNA could have been transferred or contaminated. The CCTV images were unclear. Heppy was a criminal witness with motives of his own. No one had seen Murdoch shoot Peter, and no remains had been found. Those competing positions would define the trial. The committal process and pre-trial hearings attracted enormous attention. Reporters travelled to Darwin from Britain and across Australia. Every disputed detail was examined publicly. The cable ties, the dog, the vehicle, the security video, the DNA, Joanne's private life, and Murdoch's movements. Joanne had originally helped police produce a description of the attacker. More than a year later, in November 2002, she was shown photographs and identified Murdoch as the man she believed had attacked her. The circumstances of this identification became controversial. Before the formal photographic process, Murdoch's image had appeared in media coverage and on the internet. The defense argued that Joanne's memory had been influenced by seeing a photograph associated with the case. Human recognition is vulnerable to suggestion, especially after a long delay. Once a face is repeatedly connected with an event, a witness may become more certain without the original memory becoming more accurate. The prosecution responded that Joanne had spent a prolonged and terrifying period close to her attacker. She had seen his face before the hood was placed over her head and during the struggle. Her later recognition was not presented alone. It was supported, the Crown argued, by the DNA and by the rest of the circumstantial evidence. When Joanne entered the courtroom during the trial and saw Murdoch, she identified him again. The defense subjected her to extended cross-examination. She was questioned about differences in her descriptions, the sequence in which she had been tied, the layout of the vehicle, the dog, her escape, and her communications with another man. She maintained the central account she had given from the beginning. Peter had been alive when he went behind the Kombi with the stranger. She heard a bang. The stranger returned with a gun. He restrained and attempted to abduct her. She escaped and hid until she could reach the road. The fact that some details had changed did not necessarily make the central narrative false. A violent event is not stored in memory as a perfect recording. A witness may remember the weapon and fear of death more clearly than the color of a canopy or the exact arrangement of seats. The jury had to decide whether the stable core of Joanne's evidence was truthful and reliable. The prosecution called forensic scientists to explain the DNA profile from the T-shirt. The statistical calculation presented to the jury was expressed in extremely large numbers. The profile was said to be approximately 150 quadrillion times more likely if the DNA came from Murdoch than if it came from an unrelated person selected from the population. Large forensic numbers can easily be misunderstood. They did not mean there was a 1 in 150 quadrillion chance that Murdoch was innocent. The calculation concerned the probability of obtaining the profile under competing explanations. The jury still had to consider how the DNA reached Joanne's clothing and whether laboratory handling or transfer provided a credible alternative. The Crown's explanation was direct. During the assault, Murdoch physically handled Joanne. The contact transferred his biological material onto her T-shirt. DNA associated with the restraints, and the Kombi supported the same contact. Murdoch offered another explanation. He said that he had stopped at a Red Rooster restaurant in Alice Springs and bought chicken for himself and his dog. Joanne and Peter had also visited the restaurant. The defense suggested that biological material could have been transferred through an innocent encounter or through surfaces in the premises. This became known as the Red Rooster transfer theory. It required a chain in which Murdoch's material was deposited, survived, transferred to Joanne, and appeared in a position consistent with the assault without any direct meeting between them. The prosecution argued that the theory was speculative and far less plausible than contact during the crime. The chicken purchase later attracted additional publicity because Murdoch was reported to have claimed an allergy to chicken while in custody. The apparent contradiction was widely discussed. It was not the foundation of the conviction, and reports about prison diet arrangements were not a substitute for the evidence tested at trial. The important question remained whether innocent secondary transfer reasonably explained the DNA. The cable ties were also examined. Their construction was consistent with a person who had prepared restraints rather than improvising only after stopping the Kombi. The Crown argued that this showed planning. The offender had not simply become angry during a roadside conversation. He had arrived equipped to control another person. DNA evidence connected to the gear lever was significant because Joanne said the attacker moved the Kombi from the roadside into the scrub. A profile associated with Murdoch on a control inside the vehicle was consistent with that account. The defense questioned sample quality, collection, contamination, and interpretation. The CCTV footage from the Alice Springs service station was played to the jury. The images showed a large man with a vehicle. Witnesses familiar with Murdoch gave evidence about whether he was the person recorded. His father and an associate were reported to have recognized him, although the defense emphasized the limits of the image quality and the danger of identification after a suspect had become publicly known. The timing of the footage formed part of the travel reconstruction. The Crown argued that Murdoch could commit the crime near Barrow Creek, deal with Peter's body, search for Joanne, move the Kombi, and then drive south to Alice Springs. The schedule was demanding but possible. Murdoch was accustomed to driving long distances at night and knew the road. The precise movements of the attacker after Joanne escaped could not be established. He had several urgent tasks. He needed to find Joanne before she alerted police. He needed to remove Peter or conceal his body. He needed to move the Kombi and prevent it from being immediately visible. He also needed to leave before another vehicle stopped. Joanne's escape may have destroyed the offender's original plan. If he had intended to take her away, he could no longer do so safely once she was loose in the scrub. He could not know whether she had reached the road or whether police had already been called. This may explain why Peter's remains were disposed of quickly rather than in a carefully prepared grave. The Crown called evidence about Murdoch's travel patterns and drug-running activity. James Heppy described journeys involving cannabis and Murdoch's use of vehicles and weapons. The defense attacked Heppy's credibility and argued that he had incentives to assist police. A witness involved in crime may lie to protect himself, obtain advantage, or settle personal disputes. The prosecution therefore asked the jury to rely only on parts of his evidence that were supported by independent facts. Murdoch gave evidence in his own defense. He denied being the man who stopped the Kombi and denied ever meeting Joanne. He presented himself as a person whose criminal lifestyle and appearance had made him a convenient suspect. He maintained that the Crown had built its case backward. Once investigators focused on him, they interpreted every uncertain clue as confirmation. The defense also raised reported sightings of Peter after July 14. People came forward claiming that they had seen a man resembling him at service stations or in other locations. In a case that received international publicity, such reports were inevitable. Some witnesses were sincere but mistaken. Others offered accounts that could not be verified. The prosecution examined the sightings and argued that they conflicted with one another. Descriptions of hair, clothing, companions, direction of travel, and dates did not form a coherent trail. Peter had not contacted his family, accessed his known finances in a traceable way, collected his belongings, or provided any confirmed sign that he was alive. The idea that Peter had voluntarily disappeared also required an explanation for Joanne's injuries, the restraints, the blood at the scene, the hidden Kombi, and the unknown male DNA. It required Peter to abandon his family and allow Joanne to be accused publicly while a murder inquiry continued. The jury was entitled to reject that possibility. The absence of a body did not prevent a murder conviction. Courts can find that a person is dead when the surrounding evidence excludes a reasonable possibility of continued life. In Peter's case, the violent roadside event, the gunshot-like sound, his immediate disappearance, the blood, and the conduct of the attacker supported death rather than voluntary absence. The defense emphasized what investigators did not have. There was no body to prove a bullet wound. No firearm had been recovered and linked to Peter. No witness saw Murdoch pull the trigger. No burial site connected him to the crime. The vehicle described by Joanne was not preserved in the same condition for the jury to examine years later. The case was circumstantial. Circumstantial did not mean weak by definition. A circumstantial case asks whether separate facts form a pattern that can reasonably be explained by innocence. One clue may be uncertain. Several independent clues pointing toward the same person can become powerful when considered together. The prosecution's final position was that Murdoch was not connected to the case by one accidental coincidence, but by a collection of them. He matched important features of the attacker. He had the relevant vehicle and dog. He was experienced with guns and remote travel. His movements allowed him to be at Barrow Creek. The CCTV placed a man the Crown identified as him in Alice Springs later that night. Most importantly, his DNA was found on the woman who had been physically attacked. The defense's final position was that the case contained confirmation bias. Joanne's identification had been contaminated by publicity. The DNA was vulnerable to innocent transfer and laboratory problems. The CCTV was indistinct. Heppy was unreliable. Similar vehicles and dogs were common. Murdoch's criminal history risked encouraging the jury to convict him for the type of man he was rather than for proof of this murder. The jury deliberated and returned unanimous verdicts on December 13, 2005. Bradley John Murdoch was found guilty of murdering Peter Falconio. He was also found guilty of assaulting Joanne Lees and attempting to deprive her of her liberty. The trial judge sentenced Murdoch to life imprisonment for the murder and fixed a non-parole period of 28 years. The sentence recognized the deliberate killing of Peter, the attempted abduction of Joanne, the use of a firearm and restraints, and the absence of remorse. The court's judgment established that Peter had been murdered by Murdoch. It did not establish where the body had been placed. After the verdict, investigators conducted further searches. They hoped that the conviction might produce new information or persuade Murdoch to disclose the location. He refused. He continued to say that he could not reveal something he did not know. For Peter's family, the verdict brought a formal conclusion, but not recovery. They could not hold a funeral with his remains. They could not visit a known grave. The Outback continued to contain the missing part of the case. Murdoch appealed against his conviction. His lawyers challenged the reliability of Joanne's identification, the admission and interpretation of forensic evidence, and parts of the trial process. They argued that the photographic identification had been affected by publicity and that the jury had been asked to place too much weight on evidence that was uncertain when examined individually. In January 2007, the Northern Territory Court of Criminal Appeal dismissed the appeal. Murdoch then sought special leave to appeal to the High Court of Australia. In June 2007, the High Court refused permission. The conviction remained in force. Murdoch made another attempt to challenge the conviction in 2013, but it did not overturn the verdict. Other efforts to reopen or challenge the case were also unsuccessful. Murdoch and his supporters continued to question the DNA, the CCTV identification, Joanne's account, and the absence of a body. Documentaries and books presented alternative interpretations. Some treated the case as a possible miscarriage of justice. Others repeated claims that Peter had been seen alive. A responsible account has to distinguish between legitimate scrutiny and speculation. It is legitimate to examine the way Joanne was shown photographs. Eyewitness identification can be affected by delay and media exposure. It is legitimate to ask how a DNA sample was collected, stored, tested, and interpreted. It is legitimate to question a criminal associate who gives evidence against another criminal. These issues were argued before a jury and later considered through appeals. It is different to state that Peter was alive, that Joanne invented the attack, or that police planted evidence without producing reliable proof. A theory does not become equal to the verdict merely because it can be expressed as a question. The public treatment of Joanne remained one of the most disturbing features of the case. Her affair was repeatedly used to judge her character. Her facial expressions were analyzed. Her decision to accept payment for a television interview was presented by some as evidence of dishonesty, although she said she wanted to renew public attention on Peter's disappearance. None of these matters identified another attacker. None explained Murdoch's DNA on her clothing. None produced Peter alive. Joanne later wrote about the attack and her life after it. She described the lasting effect of surviving an attempted abduction while losing Peter and then being treated as a suspect by sections of the public. Her survival had required patience and control in the bush. Those same qualities were later interpreted as emotional coldness. The location of Peter's body remained the unresolved center of the case. Initial searches concentrated near the highway and around Barrow Creek. This was logical because the offender had limited time while Joanne was missing in the scrub. However, Murdoch had a capable four-wheel drive and knew the region. He could use unsealed tracks and station roads that were unfamiliar to ordinary travelers. The prosecution theory did not establish how long Murdoch remained near the scene. The service station timing placed limits on his movements if the CCTV identification was correct, but it still allowed a substantial period for disposal. A body could be moved many kilometers from the stopping point or concealed closer to the road in a place searchers failed to recognize. The environment complicated every search. The ground could be hard and rocky in one area, loose and sandy in another. Vegetation, flooding, erosion, fire, animal activity, and station work could alter a site. A shallow grave might become less visible over time rather than more visible. Scattered remains could be moved. Search teams followed information from witnesses, prisoners, psychics, anonymous callers, journalists, and people who had studied the case independently. Wells and mine areas were considered. Searches took place near station properties and locations suggested by reported vehicle movements. No operation produced a confirmed trace of Peter. Some claims became widely publicized despite limited evidence. A possible well near Neutral Junction received attention. Later, an anonymous letter alleged that Peter's remains had been divided and transporting toward Western Australia. Police examined information of this kind, but it did not lead to a recovery. The failure to find the body encouraged the belief that it must have been taken an enormous distance. That conclusion is not necessary. Bodies are sometimes found within areas previously searched. Searchers can pass close to a burial without detecting it, particularly when the original search begins without a precise disposal profile. Dr. Mark Harrison, a specialist in searches for concealed human remains, later reviewed the case for Northern Territory Police. His work combined geography, geology, offender behavior, travel times, and the practical requirements of disposing of a body. He produced search strategies, identifying a limited number of locations considered more likely than the wider landscape. Harrison later said that further searches could still have a reasonable chance of success. He argued that the vast size of the Northern Territory should not be treated as proof that the body was impossible to find. Offenders do not choose disposal sites from every possible square kilometer. They are constrained by time, access, vehicle capability, familiarity, visibility from roads, soil conditions, and the need to leave without becoming trapped or observed. The critical question is what Murdoch did after Joanne escaped. If the attack had been planned as an abduction, her escape created a crisis. Murdoch had expected to control both the scene and the surviving witness. Instead, Joanne was somewhere in the scrub, and could appear on the highway at any moment. He did not know how soon a truck would stop or when police would establish roadblocks. Under those conditions, the disposal of Peter may have been functional rather than carefully memorable. Murdoch may have driven to a location offering immediate concealment, moved the body, and left. If he was tired, under the influence of stimulants, or focused on escape, he may not later have been able to identify an exact point in a featureless landscape. Another possibility is that he used a place already known to him. Drug runs and long-distance driving gave him familiarity with remote stopping points. A previously selected location would reduce time and risk. The evidence available publicly does not establish which possibility is correct. For years, authorities hoped that Murdoch would eventually trade information for some advantage. Prison conditions, transfer requests, appeals, illness, and the possibility of parole were all seen as possible pressure points. In 2016, the Northern Territory introduced a no-body, no-parole law. Under this approach, a prisoner convicted of murder could be denied parole unless he cooperated satisfactorily in locating the victim's remains. Murdoch was the prisoner most directly associated with the law. His earliest parole eligibility would have arrived in 2032, but without cooperation, he faced remaining in custody. The law did not produce information. Murdoch had been diagnosed with throat cancer by 2019. As his health declined, the practical value of parole became increasingly remote. Police continued to approach him. He maintained that he was innocent and knew nothing about Peter's location. In June 2025, Northern Territory Police increased the reward for information leading directly to Peter's remains to 500,000 Australian dollars. The appeal was aimed not only at Murdoch, but at anyone to whom he might have spoken. A friend, relative, criminal associate, former partner, or fellow prisoner could possess a fragment of information without knowing whether it was important. Murdoch entered palliative care at Alice Springs Hospital. In the final weeks of his life, officers made another attempt to obtain an answer. Body-worn camera footage, later released by police, showed him reacting angrily and repeating that he had no information. He refused the premise that he had anything to confess. Officers also attempted to place the human cost of the case before him. Peter's parents, Joan and Luciana Falconio, had spent more than 2 decades without their son's remains. Murdoch would not provide the location and reportedly refused to engage with a recorded appeal from the family. Bradley John Murdoch died from cancer on July 15, 2025, at the age of 67. He died one day after the 24th anniversary of Peter's disappearance. His death removed the person most likely to know what had happened to the body. It did not close the investigation. Murdoch's family continued to maintain that he had been wrongly convicted. In statements released around the 25th anniversary, they criticized aspects of the DNA and identification evidence and argued that the case remained open to challenge. They remembered him as a relative and friend, rather than as the public figure defined by the conviction. Their position does not alter the legal result. Murdoch was convicted unanimously by a jury, his appeal was dismissed, and the High Court refused special leave. He died as the convicted murderer of Peter Falconio. It is still appropriate to describe disputed points accurately. Murdoch never confessed. Peter's body was not recovered. The precise place and method of disposal were not proved. The case against Murdoch was built through eyewitness and circumstantial evidence rather than through an autopsy or a recovered weapon. Those limitations explain continued public interest. They do not mean that no proof existed. On July 14, 2026, 25 years after the attack, Northern Territory Police renewed the appeal. Investigators released previously unseen photographs from the case. The images included the orange Kombi, Joanne in the hours after the attack, evidence of her injuries, and police photographs of Murdoch. The purpose was not only historical. Police hoped that an image might trigger a memory in someone who had known Murdoch, seen his vehicle, or heard a comment about the disposal of a body. Police also released footage from the final attempts to question Murdoch before his death. It showed that he had been directly asked and had refused to change his position. The footage removed any expectation that a hidden deathbed confession existed. Northern Territory Police Commissioner Martin Dole stated that the investigation would remain open until Peter's remains were found. The $500,000 reward remained available for information leading directly to their discovery. Police emphasized that a detail appearing minor to the person who remembered it could become important when combined with the wider file. The anniversary also brought renewed attention from forensic search specialists and behavioral investigators. New documentaries presented possible disposal zones and argued that modern search methods, specialist dogs, ground examination, and geographical analysis could achieve more than was possible during the original inquiry. These modern claims must also be treated carefully. A documentary can generate useful information, but it can also present a theory with greater certainty than the evidence permits. Statements that two exact burial sites have been identified remain hypotheses until a search produces physical evidence. The strongest search work is based on constraints rather than drama. Murdoch had only a limited period. He needed vehicle access. He needed enough concealment to prevent discovery. He needed a route allowing him to reach Alice Springs within the relevant time. He may have avoided digging if the ground was difficult or if time was short. He may have used an existing depression, animal burrow, mine feature, creek bank, erosion channel, or abandoned structure. A body may also have been moved more than once. Murdoch could have concealed Peter temporarily before returning later. This would weaken calculations based only on the service station timeline. There is no public evidence proving a second visit, but it remains physically possible if Murdoch believed the original location might be discovered. The role of another person has also been considered. Murdoch's drug activities connected him with people capable of assisting after the event. No one was convicted of helping dispose of Peter, and no reliable evidence has established an accomplice. Anonymous stories about associates must therefore remain unproved. Several points are now legally and historically well supported. Peter Falconio and Joanne Lees were traveling north on the Stuart Highway on July 14, 2001. A man caused them to stop by warning of a problem with their Kombi. Peter went behind the vehicle and was never seen again by Joanne. Joanne was threatened with a firearm, restrained, and subjected to an attempted abduction. She escaped and hid in the bush before stopping a road train. The Kombi was moved and concealed after the attack. Male DNA recovered from Joanne's clothing matched Bradley Murdoch with extremely strong statistical support. Murdoch's vehicle, dog, travel experience, movements, and the Alice Springs security footage formed additional parts of the prosecution case. A jury convicted him of murder and of the offenses against Joanne. The conviction survived appeal. Murdoch never admitted responsibility and never disclosed a location. Peter's remains have not been found. Other questions remain open. Was the couple selected at a roadhouse, or did Murdoch decide to stop them only after seeing the slow Kombi on the highway? Was Peter shot immediately, as the prosecution argued, or did another struggle occur behind the van? Had Murdoch chosen a disposal location before the attack? Did Joanne's escape force him to abandon a more elaborate plan? Did he conceal Peter close to Barrow Creek, somewhere on the route to Alice Springs, or at a place connected with his longer drug-running journeys? Did he ever tell another person enough for the body to be found? And after 25 years, does the landscape still preserve evidence that modern search teams can recover? The murder of Peter Falconio is sometimes described as an unsolved case. That description is only partly correct. The murder itself was prosecuted. Bradley John Murdoch was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The courts rejected his appeal. In law, the identity of the killer was decided. The unresolved case is the search for Peter. His disappearance left his family in an unusual form of grief. They knew that a jury had accepted he was murdered, yet they were denied the physical certainty that normally follows a death. Every new search created hope. Every failed search returned them to the same position. Joanne survived because she escaped with her hands restrained, hid in darkness for hours, and judged when it was safe to approach the road. Her account became the foundation of the investigation. The public debate often focused on her personality and private life, but neither determined the forensic evidence or the verdict. Murdoch spent almost 20 years in prison after his conviction. Legal pressure, a reward, serious illness, and direct appeals did not persuade him to speak. Whether this silence came from innocence, control, resentment, or a refusal to surrender the final secret cannot now be tested by questioning him. The Australian Outback did not make the crime impossible to solve. It made one part of it exceptionally difficult. Roads, travel times, offender behavior, and geography narrowed the possibilities enough to convict a killer. They have not yet narrowed them enough to recover the victim. On the 25th anniversary, police opened the evidence boxes again and showed the public images that had remained unseen for years. The orange Kombi was no longer only a symbol from newspaper archives. Joanne's injuries were no longer an abstract part of courtroom testimony. Murdoch's final refusal was no longer known only through police summaries. The appeal is now directed toward everyone except the man who was convicted. Someone may remember a vehicle leaving the highway. Someone may know of a disturbed patch of land, an unexplained trip, a private comment, or a place Murdoch returned to. A person who once remained silent through loyalty or fear may no longer feel bound by it after his death. Until such information is found, the case ends where it began, on a dark road north of Alice Springs, with an old orange van beside the highway, a woman running into the scrub, and a 28-year-old man disappearing into the Australian interior. The courts determined who killed Peter Falconio. The land still holds the final evidence of where he was taken.